I'm Shane Kilkelly, and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This time, we're finishing off our discussion of digital socialism by Evgeny Morozov. If you didn't catch the last episode, I'd recommend pausing this one, going back one, and starting from there. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show. But then, the emergence of computing technology, right, like digitization, makes the construction and the design of those markets even easier and even cheaper. So there's a co-evolution of these things, right, where computers enable this kind of neoliberal stuff to take over, and the neoliberalism is using, the computers, and they just sort of, they co-evolve, right, in this kind of way. And that this is our technocracy that we despise, right? The fusion of economist and engineer as this market tinkerer.
It's a dialectical synthesis of the Austrian position and the neoclassical socialist position. In the debate between these two positions, we ended up with this pile of shit that we live with today, right?
The thing that is presently accelerating us towards fucking complete collapse and is Jesus, oh boy, grim.
Because I want to emphasize that it is a dialectical synthesis, but it's a synthesis between two positions that are really reprehensible. So it's they're both bad. Yeah. It's not like they took the worst parts of both. It's just they were both bad in the first place, right? It's okay, yeah, So this is a lot.
I think we're over the hump, though, with the sort of trickiest material in this essay. There's some really meaty stuff in the middle of this thing.
It's challenging for sure. So we're going to get into a little bit in this next section here about why the sort of Austrian side of things would be interested in moving towards the neoliberal, the socialist, the neoclassical socialist side of things. Why did this convergence happen from both ends?
So that brings us to the section on market modalities, law, and competition. So this is an interesting one, right? That this kind of market design project, this market design ethos, kind of gives you two different ways to reinforce and underwrite transactions to make the market better. The example that Morozov uses here is the example of what to do with bad merchants, right? How to make their reputation known. And you can go down to one of two routes. You can go down the legal route, which, strengthening contract law and this sort of stuff, or use legality to deal with that. Which would, strengthen the rights of buyers and set in stone these kind of explicit rules for handling the situation. The other way to do it is this informational or feedback route. Such as, allowing customers to rate and rank merchants, which we're all familiar with now, right? You got your fucking Yelp and your Uber and all this kind of stuff, right? That those are the ways of bringing the reputation of the merchant to the surface, right? And that's your sort of market engineering at work there in two different ways. This latter one, though, the feedback route or the informational route. It's very atomizing, right? It's extremely neolib ideology of super atomized particles in a vacuum that never actually interact with each other. It also kind of puts you under the thrall of these implicit rules, right? The implicit rules of Uber's platform, or of even beyond Uber's platform, the implicit rules of market dynamics and of capitalist competition then rule the day. And both the producers and the consumers are disciplined by that process. The informational feedback kind of works on both sides. So you get this kind of loss of, you kind of lose your rights to this thing. In general, the tendency has been to along this law versus market axis, the law tends to lose ground to the market logic in the neoliberal era. That prices and law, very abstractly, are replaced with information and feedback. And the example I've been alluding to is taxis versus Uber, right? That the taxis are that very kind of older sort of law-based kind of establishment. The prices are set by legislation, more or less, whole bunch of stuff to do with that is set by legislation. But then Uber is self-regulated just by markets, right? Like by the market dynamics of being a kind of market platform.
Right, and we talked a little bit in the platform capitalism episode about how these are like the quote unquote lean platforms, right? Like the actual staff of Uber is very small compared to the staff required to enforce taxi regulation in every country around the world, right? And this comes together to sort of fundamentally lead to a different sort of sociality, right? That, like, so for example, you know, I took an Uber to work the other day because I was late for work because I was overworked this week. I slept in and got into this van. It smelled of vomit very strongly. The seats were moist. Oof. And like that stuff is like, okay, it's early morning, like maybe you've had a rough night. Mm-hmm. Like I understand. Like I have some baseline sense of solidarity with the driver as a worker, right? Like I understand, like, okay, you know, there's mitigating circumstances, that kind of thing. But above that, I had the problem where the passenger door in the back of this van would jam shut when you closed it. So if there was any kind of accident or something, I would have died because I could not escape the vehicle.
Now you're stuck in the piss van forever.
Like,
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I had to be like, hey, buddy, can you open the windows a bit? It's a little rough in here. But yeah, it was not only the vomit van, it was also a death trap, right?
Yeah, right.
So, normally I'm not the sort of person to scold other people on these kinds of platforms, right? Because I realize how this works to the advantage of the platform holder. Right, I'm doing the managerial work of discipline on another worker. Mm-hmm.
You're doing the guard labor, right?
Yeah. But this was also like
it was kind of unacceptable, right? Yeah.
Situation, yeah. Right? And the only way I can interact with the platform is constrained by Uber. So it produces a kind of subjective disposition and a choice structure to me. That is over time, it tends to lead to less solidaristic and more atomized ways of thinking and behaving. Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And yes, I mean, we sort of achieve a kind of optimality at the cost of rights and solidarity and just, basic law stuff. Things like, taxis, at least over here, had the kind of thing of like they're kind of forbidden from refusing a fare if it's in a shitty neighborhood or whatever, whereas Uber is saying, oh, what'll the market do to you? That kind of stuff about like the door needs to be operational, really basic stuff like that. And that's traded away in exchange for a kind of optimality. But the thing that kind of has always bothered me about this stuff is that the underlying assumption, I mean, as we discussed with the theology of these fucking freaks, is that like the market will discover preferences, it'll discover information, and it'll reveal information. It'll kind of reveal a plan for society. But there's a kind of assumption there that it's the plan you want, or that like it's your preference that it discovers. Whereas, I mean, you could go down the sort of Landian path of like it discovers its preference at your expense, An optimality is perhaps achieved, or a preference is discovered, but who the fuck knows what that optimality or preference is, how that's related to you, right? Like, it probably isn't optimal for you. It might not be your preference, but something emerged. So, gotta fucking bow down before the market AI god, right?
Right. And it's even still questionable whether it actually I mean, there's literally nothing in this world that is optimal in the neoclassical sense. But, it's it's like we talked in Platform Capitalism about how these lean platforms are probably not viable in the long term at all.
Oh, when the Saudi oil runs out, they'll be fucking dead.
Yeah, or for example, like that example I just gave, right? The rolling stock of the Uber fleet degenerates because the workers are so underpaid, to the point that people stop using Uber because, like me, they don't want to die on their taxi ride, right? Like totally. It's basically this kind of like death drive that the company has, right? To just screw everyone to the maximum possible extent, except for the tiny owner class of Uber. So, and you could argue the same thing is at work in our society at large. Like, what is it optimizing for, right? That's the question you had with land there, right? The sort of Landian point. It has nothing to do with people at all. It's just the death drive. It's just the end of human civilization.
Yeah. It's whatever the process wants. It's just it does its thing, and we're fucking sock puppets to it. But yeah, so this brings us right back into the realm of the political, right? Like, I mean, who's deciding between these methods? Who gets to control? Like, who controls the technical code? At this point in the essay, there's a really interesting sort of opposition developing. I would phrase it as kind of Leviathan versus cybernetics, right? Like that kind of the law versus the informational feedback systems, which I was kind of sweating it. I was like, Jesus, oh boy, like are we gonna have to fucking change tack here or something? But no, this is resolved wonderfully in part 3, modes of social coordination. So now we're focusing on feedback infrastructure. Right, this is clearly a thing. I mean, as we're fond of discussing with cybernetics, this is definitely a thing, right? The design of feedback infrastructure, but who gets to own it? Who controls the technical code? There's a little bit of a section then about the neoliberal conceptions of feedback, and then we're going to get on to feedback infrastructure for the left. So for the neolibs, the operation of this feedback infrastructure serves more or less two purposes. Firstly, to fix problems that clog up markets, like that's your market design stuff, but also to prevent unwanted non-market solutions from emerging. Like, we have to keep in mind there is an ideological project there which not only constructs markets but forbids non-markets from ever being social solutions.
And that's part of the synthesis, right? As the neoclassical socialists go further down this route of market engineering, they lose all interest in anything other than markets. And the Austrian side of this, they sort of win out in terms of the primacy of markets and getting this information idea out there. But they're forced to compromise with the neoclassical socialists, these kind of constructivists, given the fact that hardcore market fundamentalist restructuring programs lead to social chaos, not the actual outcome that Austrians imagine would happen, based on their sort of theological conception of the way markets work.
Right, yeah. Like, I mean, dismantling non-market forms of coordination, like, it demands a functional alternative, but just sitting there staring at a pile of rubble, hoping that it'll spontaneously organize itself, doesn't fucking work. So resentment builds. So the political project, that political project is impossible, right? Like, so you need to then bring yourself into this weird split brain kind of personality disorder where it's like, oh, we believe in this spontaneous order that'll just, like, it's the work of God in the material world, but also we must intervene on its behalf to help it along, or to even, like, I mean, at this point in history, it's not even just helping it along. I think it's like holding the thing together with baling twine and duct tape, right? That, like, it is in fact falling apart, and you've just got these fucking goons, like, just wrapping it up in sellotape to just try desperately to keep it from falling apart. Because, like, I mean, we could go back to our sort of stuff about cybernetics, right? But, like, spontaneous self-order or whatever is often a stochastic kind of process, and it doesn't create the things you want very often. You often need to intervene to design for it and stuff. But then if you're in this camp, you're then doing the opposite of what you say you're doing. It's like, oh, the market decides, but I decide. I decide what the market decides. I decide what I decide, the market decides, I decide, and all this kind of shit. And it's like, it's an incoherent fucking bullshit program. This is a wonderful scathing takedown as it's written in the piece. I absolutely love it. But I think it has to also serve as a stark warning for left spontaneists as well, right? Like, similar to what our colleagues at the Emancipation Network have been covering on From Alpha to Omega. They've been reading Revolutionary Strategy by Mike McNair. And a pretty big part of that is this like massive critique of the sort of left of the left, spontaneist, I guess anarchist sort of tradition of, oh, we'll just burn shit down and hope for the best, or we'll party in the streets and a spontaneous, beautiful new order will emerge. It's like, you're fucking kidding yourselves. You need to actually pose real alternatives to, if you're going to destroy something, you have to build something else in parallel. That applies to left spontaneists. It definitely applies to neoliberals. And I wonder if there's much distance between the two at this point.
You get a lot of weird, like, horseshoe bending kind of stuff with that, for sure. There are places where, you have people who are, like, autonomous. They're not neoliberals, but they may sort of go along with neoliberal things because they sort of have a spontaneous orientation. And the other thing that really comes up in that Revolutionary Strategy series, which you can also find me guesting on sometimes, is the critique of the mass strike. Right. So the view that the mass strike will just somehow produce socialism, right? Like, we're going to shut the whole thing down, and they'll see that we as workers have all the power. And maybe not. Maybe people start running out of food. Mm-hmm. Maybe things stop working completely. So the next argument there would be, but we'll have the mass strike, and when the workers see that they have an opportunity to work together and build society independently from the capitalists because they're no longer constrained by them, then the socialism will spontaneously emerge. And it's like,
you kind of have to take
maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, you have, like, it immediately reposes the problem of social coordination at scale, which is the thing that the anarchists are fucking petrified of. And I know that from experience, having been an anarchist and in those kind of organizations, that, like, I don't know, because, I mean, if you do that, like, it's just going to be like, oh, we're all starving, there's no electricity, all the hospitals are shut down, like, my kid is ill, let's kill these fucking anarchists and get back to something functional, like, this isn't going to work,
Yeah, and maybe we don't need to trick the working class into creating socialism.
That's what it is, right? It's a trick. It's like it's a way of short-circuiting the process, because, like, it's a long, dreary road to building, like, a different way of coordinating society. And it's this, I mean, it rhymes as well with what the neoliberals want. It's the one weird trick that's just going to fucking fix it all, right? Like, it's you do this one thing and it'll short circuit the process, and it won't. But anyway, I think that's our portion of punching left for the episode. We do get on to something quite positive then towards the end of the essay. Feedback infrastructure and the left. Morozov here is saying that, like, we can't, as leftists, we can't just dismiss the feedback infrastructure as digital Hayekianism. We can't do the thing that some people do where they're just mistrustful of quantification in general. Like, oh, the very fact that we have numbers is an original sin. We need to go back to a pre-symbolic mode of thinking to really have true socialism. Get that out of fucking here. That is bullshit.
That's when you get to the true primi ideology, right? Like, back in the day, people communicated telepathically. They didn't have symbols.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Like, I find that stuff incredible. It's like the sub-Kaczynskiite fucking primitivism of, like, like, Kaczynski was a real fucking... the Unabomber was a real sellout because he used words and symbolic thought to convey his...
right.
God damn. You get a lot of that shit from fucking anarchists, though. The anarchist to, like, fucking Primi Unabomber shit pipeline is weirdly wide. Very worrying. Anyway, but we can't resist, right? We just have to fucking get it in there. So, like, we can't coordinate a complex society without some quantification. But we also shouldn't uncritically defend the old law. Like, we shouldn't just kind of pile on with Leviathan because it happens to be the thing that's opposed in spirit to the sort of acid bath of neoliberalism. We also get, like, this example of, like, the kind of dark potentiality of this stuff, like the example being China and its current, like, fucking social credit system or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with both of these solutions is that they take us back to the state, right? So it's definitely not where we want to go, and I feel like that's generally the sort of direction you get out of, like, nostalgic social democrats, right? This defend the old law perspective, like, go back to a state regulated society. That's I don't think that's really where we want to be going.
Because guess what, folks, that sucked too.
That's the stuff that Beer was critiquing back in the 70s, right?
Right. He was definitely critiquing that, but also it also ties in with the kind of Beer ties in with the dark potentiality bit, and that, like, in Designing Freedom, Beer points out the need to engage in the design of this kind of infrastructure precisely because it is dangerous. That, like, when you're handling the sharp scissors, you need to pay fucking attention to what you're doing and really think about what you're going to do with that.
And there's just a litany of examples of how just, like, this reckless cowboy capitalism approach to the social media management, platform design has created really horrific social outcomes. And, like, you look at, there's a lot of it out there.
Yep, we're all familiar.
So, it's very much the running with scissors problem, right? Move fast, break things.
Get your fucking
move fast with scissors.
Kind of
move fast, stab things.
Yeah.
You know, that's the running with scissors version of that dictum.
Oh yeah. But Morozov then kind of brings us through three other possibilities that would not simply be more of the same or a retreat to the old Leviathan. These three new possibilities are kind of, the way he says it is, solidarity as discovery procedure, designing non-markets, and automated planning. These are really interesting sections. The solidarity as discovery procedure is pretty straightforward concept. Is that, like, for Hayek, competition... especially in later Hayek, competition is a kind of heuristic process for discovery. It's a distributed process that finds preferences in the world. But of course, there are other non-competition heuristics that you could use, and crucially, not central planning either. Like, this would be different from both of those.
Right, and it doesn't just find preferences; it also generates preferences.
Yeah.
It's generative as well as analytical. That's true, right? Like, we can definitely see that. Like, you have, hot new market trends that come up, and it becomes, people's preference and all that sort of thing. But contra Hayek, right? We could say, what if we could have a heuristic process for discovery and generation that was not market-based?
Yeah, totally.
Right.
The examples here are a little thin. It's a bit kind of high level, but, like, if you can imagine a sort of process centered on social life and problem solving, using digital infrastructure to flag up social problems and facilitate deliberation, facilitate mass democracy around figuring things out, and matching problem finders to problem solvers. One of these sort of concrete examples, or the sort of hints of an example that's called out here, is hackathons, which are a thing where often it's NGOs of some kind that are organizing a little kind of get-together with pizza and beer and a room full of computers to get hackers to just kind of thrash out ideas for solving, I don't fucking know, like ambulances in Kazakhstan or whatever, how to make them more efficient. It's compelling, right? But the core argument is that, like, look, competition is not the only heuristic for discovery in society, and nor is central planning. Those two positions do not exhaust the whole landscape of different ways that you could coordinate and discover preferences, things, information in society.
Right. And so what is envisioned here is like a much broader scale process, and one where, maybe problem finders and problem solvers are well off enough materially to do this in a way that isn't just about like sort of time charity or labor charity, right? Like, because the hackathons, they have sort of a portfolio building aspect to them, but they also have a kind of charitable aspect to them, and they feel very like peripheral to production in a way that doesn't sort of suggest a new social form immediately. So you have to use your imagination a little bit to imagine this as more of a kind of everyday sort of behavior than a once a year or twice a year kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. The next sort of proposal is for designing non-markets. This gets really interesting, right? Because obviously, like, complexity, complex systems, society is complex, all that kind of stuff. Markets have worked pretty well at actually scaling up to gigantic, like, world-spanning scales, and there's this problem of how to scale non-markets that requires careful design. It requires us to, like, as I said, careful design. You need to think about it. And our old boy Stafford Beer comes back in with cybernetics, right? This is kind of the science of how you design these things, how you design solutions to complex problems. I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled to see Beer show up here.
Same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. It was nice to see that, like, it wasn't just us counterposing Hayek to Beer.
Yeah.
Morozov has also been doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's really, really cool.
Yeah, as you said, very reassuring to kind of know that you're not entirely alone in this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, this is a pretty short section that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of, like, Beer, Cybersyn, very broad strokes of, like, viable system model, and particularly honing in on recursivity as Beer's solution being different from Hayek's. Right, so the solution to the problems of complexity. So that, like, for Hayek, it was like a kind of a lost cause to try and design for these things. But for Beer, it's very much the opposite. He's like, no, with clever engineering and a little bit of science, you can actually get really far with this stuff. And social life is already replete with examples of consciously, deliberately constructed systems which handle complexity. So, institutions, firms, traffic systems, and on and on and on. All the stuff you get in Beer's works, right? This is kind of wonderful, right? Because, like, for Hayek, there's a single spontaneous order, which is the market. Capital T, capital M, the market. But for Beer, spontaneous orders or viable systems are nested recursively, so that they're structured, but they are quite spontaneous. There's a lot of autonomy involved in the viable system model. And this is quite a difference, right? Because for Beer, the recursive nesting of spontaneous orders allows the nested set of systems to kind of tile the plane in a way, right? That they can fit the environment at each level and achieve in aggregate a kind of total blanketing of the problem space. Which is a huge difference, right? It's in terms of Beer's cybernetics, the thing that Hayek proposes is kind of on its face laughable, because the proposal is that there will be a single governing principle that would be the one and only coordinator for the entire society. And for Beer, that would never pass muster. It's like it doesn't have requisite variety. It is like you can kind of prove it on paper that it wouldn't be capable of responding to every problem. It's kind of overly broad, and its imposition is overly authoritarian.
Yeah, and I think the crucial point here is, of course, Hayek recognized that there are a lot of different institutions and norms that facilitate the existence of a market society, right? So it's not just the pure principle of market exchange. But what, especially in this kind of market fundamentalist inspired like restructuring of society we see is a attenuation of variety from the top down in order to make things conform with that regulative principle of the market, right? So it's, in a way, it is it's specifically neoliberal in the sense in which it is trying to impose a particular view of the norms that used to exist and which people like Hayek defended. So it's that kind of active, aggressive conservatism that is imposing variety attenuation on society in order to somehow desperately try to create the spontaneous order that they glorify.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, for beer, that's just a recipe for disaster. Like it's a recipe for instability. It doesn't actually have requisite variety to achieve the ends that it wants, and so it's kind of destined to this death spiral. Like it'll just spiral onwards, and the system will constantly try to reinforce itself and fail at each step, and it'll all spiral out of control, which is what we're experiencing. Yay, amazing.
It is what we're experiencing. And also, again, we can go back to that example of Sears, right? What happened with Sears when you tried to just impose this one invariant model on the management of an enormous company, and just death spiral, right?
And like a crucial difference there is that the difference between a sort of single level kind of ontology versus beer's recursive thing. The correct way of designing variety engineering, like amplifiers and attenuators and all these kind of systems, the correct way of designing those at each level of the system is an open question for beer. It's not settled. And so there's an open exploratory kind of framework for generating solutions to social problems at multiple scales, which is a vastly richer model than Hayek's, right? Like the Hayek's with like there's a sort of there's a divine singularity to it all, and it applies at a single level. There's one blanket sort of thing.
Well, it's like it talks about variety, but it doesn't have a way of actively characterizing, analyzing, and diagnosing variety, right? Because it's a gloss of how society functions, rather than looking at the individual parts, the individual stages of recursion, because like that makes a lot of sense given the place that Hayek was coming from, which was this anti-constructivism, right? That like if you are not interested in going out and engineering solutions, then you're not really interested in developing an analytic framework for doing that, right? You're much more interested in just sort of giving a general characterization of society because you don't want it to change, right?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, great section. Really wonderful stuff. The final section then is on decentralized planning, which kind of brings us back to People's Republic of Walmart land. We could have used big data on the consumption side to plan. We could use automated production. Both of these potentialities are currently arrested by capitalist relations, but there is great potential to free them from those relations and have it rhymes again with what Beer was suggesting, right, or what Beer started to implement in Chile with Cybersyn. This like decentralized planning apparatus that would figure things out without too much central coordination, without central authority, and without it simply being a fucking nightmarish mess of prices sloshing over each other. We get introduced to this other author, Daniel Saros, a book, Information Technology and Socialist Construction, in which Saros outlines this, what seems like a very compelling model for a decentralized planned economy. There's a couple of things here that are really interesting, like the notion that you would have like a central catalog, or a general catalog, I think it's called, of all goods that can be produced. And at the beginning of each production period, consumers register their preferences, like their requests and ranked preferences for goods. Producers register their needs for inputs and so on, and then they go do their thing for that production cycle, and you just go around in the loop.
Yeah, so the crucial difference there from some other similar schemes is that although you do create a ranked list of commodity preferences at the beginning, or item preferences at the beginning of the production period, you do have the opportunity to change your mind and buy sort of eventualities, right? So those are priced higher in terms of sort of the unit of account that is used for the planning system, but you have the opportunity to do that, so you don't have to like plan everything up front. Like, okay, for the next month, I'm going to need this much toilet paper, these many chicken breasts, blah, 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 right? Like, plan every little thing. And then once you're locked into that system, you're screwed. And the only way that you can redistribute or figure out what you need is to barter with your neighbors, right? Like, that seems like kind of a nightmare scenario. But this one would allow you to actually change things up in the middle of the production period. It would just cost you a bit more to do so. So that seems like a relatively attractive solution to that problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and like Morozov mentions that there's kind of bits about like how shortages could be socialized and surpluses could just be eliminated, basically, that avoided, that like you would have kind of fairly close to perfect planning of exactly what's needed. And this could all be tied into whatever, like labor tokens or UBI or whatever the fuck it is that is the unit of account. At this point, like, price is basically a technology that's used in a non-capitalist distributed planning system, so that there would be...
Yeah, it's the way that Kantorovich uses it, right? There's a specific term that is used, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
Is it shadow prices?
Yeah, I think that's one of them. I think there's another one as well that you could use, but it's like it has all the characteristics of price, except it isn't actually something generated by exchange, right? So it's I don't know. I think we talked about this a little bit in the Red Plenty episode, but we could maybe go back to this if we ever cover information technology and socialist construction.
Yeah. I feel like, I mean, that this stuff is very clearly not price, really. It's kind of like it's a number that's attached to things, but like, oh boy, it doesn't resemble anything we know, really. Call it a score. Who the fuck cares? You know, it's whatever. Yeah.
There's definitely systems that exist in the world today that use this kind of price. You know, but I again, it's like I feel like we could maybe do an episode on this subject, or we could cover some kind of related topic, just to sort of clarify that, because I actually had a conversation with Paul Cockshott about this some time ago, just to clarify what exactly this thing was, and it's worth thinking about, because there are a lot of people who will say, oh no, those are just prices. But like, it's like, no, actually, they're not, right? Because
you're thinking of numbers. That's what those are.
Yeah, they originate from a fundamentally different sort of social process than the prices we're familiar with are. Dude, yeah.
Maybe we should just read that book, Information Technology and Socialist Construction. We could probably get our hands on that.
Well, we got to take a look at how big it is first.
Yeah,
it's like, you know, this 2,000-page utopian socialist tome. Who knows? I mean, it's definitely at the top of my list in terms of interest, for sure, though. Because it's kind of one of these books that are out there that are a little bit of like an alternative to Cockshott and Cottrell's book, right?
Right. Well, I mean, if it was if it was a bit less turfy, that would be an instant fucking win anyway.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We'll look into it, listeners. We'll see. That could be a cool episode. But anyway, like, so one of the last remarks in that section is that, like, a kind of a shadow of this does exist in Amazon, basically, like, to tie back to that People's Republic of Walmart thing. I mean, like, Amazon and its gigantic general catalog does influence production, right? Like, and there's that kind of just-in-time production and delivery aspect to it. Like
predictive delivery, that kind of stuff.
It's getting there, right? Like, it's really getting there.
You know, like, yeah, like there's, I mean, again, People's Republic of Walmart makes a pretty good case for the fact that Amazon is a planned economy and not a market economy. Yeah.
Oh, totally. And then the final section is called Socialize the Means of Feedback Production, which is kind of right up our alley. Like, and all of these projects that have been outlined here hint at a way of taming the complexity of the world without competition and markets. We can't really realize that potential, though, if the feedback infrastructure remains in private hands. So, I mean, this is starting to sound like kind of the end of most of our episodes, right? Like, it's we need to socialize this shit pretty fast. One thing that's really interesting here is that Morozov is kind of pointing us in the direction of, like, not wasting our time debating the merits and the ins and outs of price without thinking about its embeddedness in the wider capitalist system. So we're being invited to think more about the capitalist system overall as a network of competition, as a ratchet of accumulation, all that kind of stuff. And it kind of like what we hinted at just previously with the whole, people will object of, like, those numbers are just prices. It's kind of not the point, right? Like, just leave that shit aside. Like, we're probably focusing on the wrong level of granularity. Not that there's no value at all to going bug collecting on the kind of, like, ins and outs of the minutiae of economics and stuff, but, like, it's a system. We need to deal with it systematically at a high level.
Right, and I think another thing here is that Morozov identifies the problems with defending central planning, right? Where it's like, what we're advocating for could maybe be described as central planning, but it might not be a valuable way to talk about it, because as we sort of have seen in talking about beer and designing freedom, that centralization versus decentralization dichotomy isn't a very useful one once you actually get into, like, a more cybernetic understanding of this stuff and, like, thinking about how to use the VSM, that kind of stuff. Like, it is certainly not a planning system that would resemble Gosplan in any meaningful way, right? Or even the central planning mechanisms that the neoclassical socialists, like, long ago came up with in the mid 20th century.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of loops back around to pretty much the very beginning of this series, right? This show, that, like, we are, as Morozov puts it here, we are still living in the ideological shadow of the 20th century, and particularly the Cold War, right? Like, and the neoliberals are still, or the whatever the fuck this system is now, is still just digging the same old hole as ever. And it's very upsetting to me that, like, socialists and communists, when they're fired up to go and, change the world, they immediately go back to fucking Stalinism as, like, oh, we should just do Gosplan again. It's like, you fucking dullards. Like, how could this not have sunk in by now? Like, come on.
Right.
God damn it, people.
It just doesn't work. Yeah. Totally.
So we need some imagination.
So, again, I'm just really impressed with this essay. You look at Morozov's biography, and, like, he's got this very, like, centrist lib background in terms of, like, the positions he's held. Like, he's been on the TED circuit, he's been at all these boring ass think tanks. He's written for the New Yorker. Like, it's real, like, lukewarm stuff. But, he always had this, like, really intelligent critique of the stuff he was talking about. And it's really interesting to see him go in this socialist direction. and saying like socialize the means of feedback production, a direction that certainly seems quite Marxist to me, although it doesn't really, it doesn't have anything to say about labor theory of value, that kind of stuff, but it seems pretty Marxist to me, and quite valuable, quite innovative. I guess the only thing that really came up that we didn't mention was he talks about the Soros book and how there's no sort of constraint on consumption, so people can just kind of consume as much as they want, and like that might come into conflict with eco-socialism. And I guess for me that's kind of like really like a question of your System 5 kind of considerations, right?
Yeah.
If you think about this in a VSM sort of way, like you need to adjust that perspective, because as it stands, there is a way in which that sort of rhymes with the we're past capitalism, but it's still just consumerism that we saw with Mayor Schoenberger, right? So maybe if we look at that book, I would be interested to sort of see like, okay, well, where could you do the System 5 adjustments to create a different kind of like regulative principle for this approach?
Yeah, because that's the very highest level of even what sort of beer is concerned with, like how to do mass social organization in a way that it does reflect the preferences of the populace and allows the populace to steer itself in policy directions that like closing the loop between like production, consumption, and those sort of general policies of like, we as a mass society decide that we're sick of this ecological collapse shit and we'd really rather not get eliminated by it. That's definitely, it would be really cool to see if that's in there as a thing, because as you said, it's a big danger of just like imagining every one of these futures as a continuation / augmentation of the present, as in like lifestyles don't change at all. There's, as in like consumption patterns are the same. It's just like it's magicked away. That's a thing I found very disappointing about a lot of contemporary discourse in the left around these sorts of things, and I think it sort of reaches its kind of apex in the kind of fully automated luxury communism sort of stuff, where it's like I don't know. With the ecological mess we're in, I don't think there's any possibility that our lifestyles aren't going to change. I think that's the way I'll put it, is that I think that like if we're imagining a future where the mode of production is different and our social relations are different, but it's our minute-to-minute lives are exactly the same, I think that's probably horseshit, and we should probably interrogate why we believe that would, or why we don't question why that would not be the case,
Right. There's a way of thinking about adaptation. Greenland is melting.
It's melted. It's fucking gone.
Apparently this was supposed to happen in 2070, but it looks like we're about 50 years early on that schedule. Adaptation is a real concern. It's an immediate concern, and we have to do adaptation without being Malthusians, and we also have to do this kind of utopian exploratory work without bracketing out reality, right? Because we come from this heritage of the 19th century that viewed human economic development exclusive of the environment. And that's a really, really, really heavy bias in economics. It is in our society in general, but especially in economics. There's obviously ecological economics and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't. It's that we need to go further with this stuff, right? And so this kind of I'm not sure exactly when this Soros book came out. Let's see, 2014. Yeah, so it's quite late. So this Soros book has come out quite recently, but similar to the Cockshot book, it seems to not grapple with this question seriously, and we really need to do work on that. So I don't know. I mean, these are future discussions to have, but I think that this essay, Digital Socialism, definitely is thought-provoking, and I would say, like, the call to action is certainly, think through this stuff outside the context of just production and distribution, but also this kind of designing non-market stuff. Like, there are people out there doing this kind of thing. Like, I think about, like, Lumio, right? Like, that's the kind of thing they do. But yeah, we could use more of that, right? We could use more of that out there, because I think the perspective that comes out of what Morozov is saying is that it's not a monolithic answer. That's not what we're aiming towards. We're aiming towards something that deals with variety, and so there can be a number of components to it. So it is worth experimenting with today, in whatever way we can. Yeah,
definitely. I think that's really, really important, right? That, like, there's a gigantic problem, right? The variety of the problem is enormous, and that we do have seemingly at our fingertips a kind of tantalizing catalogue of possible partial solutions, or stuff that's at least worth investigating further to see if there's resonance between them. Like, for instance, between beer and Saros, there probably is. My guess would be you could probably bring a Beerian analysis to that and be like, oh, these totally fit together. I kind of want to caution again. I think, so the way I'll put it is that this essay helps us to get in the direction of not seeking silver bullets, right? That we're not going to find a singular silver bullet solution. We're not going to find one book, go down to a fucking radical bookstore in, like, Birmingham or something and be like, oh, look at this book, gives us the one trick to figuring it all out, because that fucking pattern of thought has led us to this fucking disaster, right? Like, and in the left has caused us to fuck up over and over again. The pattern of thought of seeking silver bullet solutions, seeking totalizing solutions, right? I don't know if we've heard this feedback specifically, but I can totally imagine, like, a straw man in my head giving me this feedback with the beer stuff of, like, oh, but that's not everything, it's not gonna solve every fucking problem. It's like, it doesn't need to, this will probably be a jigsaw of various overlapping systems that, I mean, because, like, that's what Morozov is asking us to focus on, is systems, right? Like the capitalist system as a interlocking process of competition and markets and all sorts of crazy bullshit, and to think about constructing our own equally psychotic systematic solution to the problem of organizing society, right? Yeah, really good stuff. Is there anything else we need to cover, do you think?
I don't think so. I think we've done it.
Pretty much. Fabulous. Yep. Thanks, listeners, for coming along with us on this one. It is always appreciated. We're really thrilled that we have a fan base at all. It's kind of amazing. If you want to keep up with us on the internet, we're on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We are on the internet proper at generalintellectunit.net. We're on Facebook. I don't know for anywhere else. That's probably it.
Well, there's the Discord.
Oh, yeah.
Of course.
So you can go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month, and at the $5 level, you will get access to our community Discord, where we have good chats and read cool things.
And as I mentioned earlier, I have been guesting on From Alpha to Omega. So those would come out in the sort of most recent episodes in that very, very, very long series.
So fucking
on
slow.
Revolutionary strategy.
It is astonishing to me that, like, I think as of recording, the most recent episode or two of that is, like, basically 2 paragraphs per episode. And I'm like, God damn it, guys, come on.
I mean, we really got into it in the last recording session there, and it was like, I think we covered like 5 pages. Like it is glacial, the rate at which we're going through that book, but every episode is a good discussion as well, because it just touches on so many things, right? So it's a very long series for just one book, but really interesting discussions there. I'm not on every episode. I'm not on the first section of episodes. I came in like in the late tail end of the series. But if you want to hear me talk a little bit more about like the hardcore Marxology, like the really, really just, the stuff we don't cover on this show because it's a little bit too obscure, a little bit too inside baseball, then you can hear that there for sure. Yeah,
it's a wonderful series, and I think like it's the sort of great thing about the Emancipation Project is like taking this collection of like Marxist intellectuals and just putting them in a pressure cooker together for a couple of hours every week, and just you get absolutely wonderful stuff falling out of it. I have a feeling that by the time our episode here is released, at least one of your recordings from Alpha to Omega will have come out. At least I kind of hope.
I think so.
So that's how the timing will work out there. Well, I don't know.
And the book Revolutionary Strategy by Mike McNair is you can get it as a PDF online. Just search for it, you'll find it. Not actually a huge read.
No, extremely readable.
Just a huge listen. That's all.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fun book in that like it there's some really, really great material in it, but then there's these kind of weird sections where he's talking about how the kind of McSweeneyite wing of the fucking Birmingham People's Front split and became a trot sect and became the People's Front of Birmingham or whatever. And it's just like, it's just inside the minutiae of like British communists, like not even just communists in general, but just Brits. Kind of hard to get through, but in some places, but overall it's wonderful.
That stuff is usually accompanied by a lot of sick burns, so
yeah,
it's like reading Capital, right? The vitriol helps it go down.
Speaking of all that, you can go to emancipation.network on the internet and check out our sister shows From Alpha to Omega and Swampside Chats. They're great. They're really fucking good. Wonderful shows.
Recent Swampside episode on Mike Davis. Really good. Would recommend that.
That's the ones titled Old Gods, New Enigmas, Parts 1 and 2.
Yeah, that's right.
Really good stuff.
That's right.
We probably, by the time this comes out, we'll have had a collaboration episode with Swampside be released anyway. So that already happened in the past. It's in the future for us now. But anyway. We're going to do more of that in the future. But yeah, thanks again for coming along, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.